Welcome to this week's lesson on trauma and recovery. We're basically going to be looking at the triphasic model of treatment, which we have as a result of the work of Judith Herman. And we're going to talk a little bit about the book that she wrote. We're going to talk about some of the ideas that she proposed. And I probably should let you know that my voice is kind of scratchy because I'm fighting a cold. And I'm also sitting on my back porch, so you may have occasionally hear bird noises from the trees around here. So, with that caveat, let's go ahead and begin. Trauma and recovery, the triphasic approach to treating trauma. I'm assuming that most of you have read Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery. If not in the last week or so, certainly in the past. It is a foundational book to the work that we do in trauma. And many of the ideas that we're going to talk about today were originally offered and launched by Judith Herman in her 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery. So with that little bit, with that little bit said, let's go ahead and move forward. One of the things we need to look at, and as an idea that came from Judith Herman's work, is that not all trauma equals PTSD, and PTSD doesn't always require something awful to happen. Now, most of the time when we look at the research and we look at how people define trauma, you don't get that sense to it. But she was one of the first to really kind of introduce the idea that trauma was a little broader than just the horrific things that happened to people. Not that she minimized those in any stretch, because her primary focus in producing the book was one of political action. She wanted the international community to take on the idea that political and social issues, wars, conflicts, police actions, um, and the human condition in many parts of the world were actually creating trauma in the lives of people. But as we kind of go through this, we're going to look at how trauma does not always lead to PTSD. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how traumas may lead to PTSD, but a good portion of the folks that have that experience of PTSD recover quite well and do so outside of the therapeutic world. And we also talk about how we're going to talk about how a lot of bad things happen to people that are not necessarily an assaultive, violent trauma. And that's one of the difficulties that we run into when we start defining it. The DSM, of course, um, in the United States and ICD-10s and other parts of the Western world usually defines trauma as these life-overwhelming, life-threatening, incredibly fear-provoking incidents. What we want to do for the purposes of our lesson today is to talk about how that definition is probably not adequate for those of us that work in the trauma community. And I would like to redefine trauma, at least for the purposes of our course here, in this way. That repeated activation of the threat response system that persistently alters our attributions, or the way we give meaning to the world, and our expectations, and they force us to generate adaptations in physiology, behavior, relationships, and perceptions. So that's a little different view of trauma, but what that does is allows us not only to embrace the formal and more traditional historical definition of trauma, but also opens the door for us to understand that there are environments that people adapt to, and the fact that people have to adapt to an adversive situation often is traumatic to them. And we see it played out in a number of situations to varying degrees. One of the examples that I use sometimes when I'm working with groups is to talk about how many people in their work history had somebody that was particularly um, aggravating for them. And it didn't really matter if it was because they were mean and hateful, or they were one of those people that um, is annoying in some other way. But did interaction with them lead to adaptions in the workplace? And so I gave several examples. And one particular lady that was in Dallas made a really funny comment to me. She said that her office was at the end of a hallway, and that you could go out the exit, which was a fire door, and you could walk all the way around the building. And the person that she struggled with and was constantly aroused by was in the office next to hers in the hallway that led to the inner part of the building. And she said that she, over time, over the 3.5, 4 years that she worked in that facility, she ended up going out the fire door and walking entirely around the building, which was a relatively large building, she said, of about 12,000 square feet or something like that. Um, she walked all the way around the building to come in the front door so she could avoid walking past this person's office. Now, that is an adaptation based on adversive experience. Now, granted, it's not traumatic in the terms that we're thinking about, but we frequently adapt to adversive situations without without a conscious thought process being involved. And that's one of the hallmarks of repeated activation of the threat response system, is that it persistently puts us in a place where we are making adaptations, and those adaptations aren't just in behavioral terms, they are physiological, and they're relational, and they're perceptual. So hopefully that makes enough sense, and I haven't stumbled through it so badly that you're going, what did he say? But if I can convey that to you, that it helps us broaden out to embrace not only individual trauma of a violent nature, but it also then allows us to embrace trauma from the perspective of, family dynamic or workplace dynamic. So let's move into the idea of what is considered an effective treatment for PTSD. Right now, there is tremendous discussion about best practice treatments that are empirically validated. Part of this is certainly driven by our desire to not waste time and energy and to provide the best quality of care and the most succinctly delivered care that can possibly be done for those people that are suffering. However, a part of this is also driven by the politics of mental health. One of the dangers of best practice isn't that we aren't trying to develop ways to help people more effectively. The danger of a best practice model is people tend to align to them with almost religious fervor. And one of the things that we have come to understand as we've done research on trauma is that most models will work. And in fact, if you embed a treatment model in an overall structure that is trauma informed and trauma sensitive, most models will be equivalently effective. Now, I sat in a room full of therapists at a conference recently and made that statement, and I could clearly see that about 18, 19 people out of this room of 50 were taking mental exception with my statement. And so we paused and talked a little bit about it. Well, some of them were trauma-focused CBT folks. Some of them were DBT folks, and some were EMDR folks. And each one believed that their view was the absolute truth when it came to the treatment of trauma. That's the danger with a best practice, is this mentality that they actually have the absolute truth. And while they talk about being trauma sensitive and client centered, if you have a Catholicism that is so solidly one sided, then you are going to see the entire world through that lens. And while it's a better lens than not having a trauma lens, it can also be a lens that interferes with the treatment. How many of you that have been trained in a particular model have found that not all people that you work with enjoy it the same or tolerate it as much as some other model? So, one of the things that I really appreciate about Judith Herman's work is that she, while she acknowledges that models are important, she also acknowledges that a structure that leads to better overall trauma sensitive treatment is probably a more useful tool for most folks. And as you read through her book, you get this incredible sense that she finds that the structure really aids in the overall delivery of true recovery for those that she was so concerned about helping. I admire that. It's such a forward thought for her time. Yes, there were people, way back. Janae talked about trauma and wrote about it in very succinct ways. It could be very helpful. It was not popular at the time in the world, and the psychological community kind of poo-pooed it and was lost to us for a long time. But Judith Herman really needs to be admired for taking a stance in 1992, and after years of research, careful thought, and discussion with many other professionals, she came up with this triphasic structure. And the triphasic structure, basically, in her view, was three elements: safety and stabilization, focus on trauma resolution, and then reconnection with all of the things that generally bring pleasure to people's lives. As we begin to look at how to implement this kind of structure into our clinical work, and to help us stay away from the overcommitment, if you will, to a particular model of treatment, but really target what works for the individual, we have also kind of added to that structure a collaborative piece, that part of safety and stabilization that sets the stage for good treatment and for reconnection with the community is really based on a collaboration with the client that is feedback driven. In other words, every week at the end of the session, the client is giving an idea to the therapist of what they experienced and how it was experienced for them. Excuse me. Then that experience in the next session is used to guide the direction of where we're going, so that it is always a living, breathing therapeutic experience for the client based on the client's particular needs, particular preferences, particular skills and abilities, and the particular strengths and resiliency factors that the therapist discovers in the part of the client. When you talk in the in the trauma community, particularly around treatment of PTSD, a lot of this is driven by research in military situations. And what unsurprisingly has emerged is that cognitive behavior treatments have become kind of the primary focus as being the most effective psychotherapy treatments for trauma. And that is absolutely statistically true. However, that cognitive behavior models, for example, the trauma focused CBT, is not necessarily the only cognitive behavior treatment that is effective. I would propose that when we're doing psychoeducation at any point, we are doing cognitive restructuring. And the cognitive restructuring is an intricate part to helping the client see things differently, to experience things differently, and to achieve changes of state. So I agree that cognitive behavior treatments are probably the most effective single therapeutic approach to healing trauma. However, that will look different for each and every individual. And that's part of the frustration on the parts of large agencies in dealing with trauma, is that they want to have a, if you want to think of it this way, a reduced and simplified reification of treatment so that they have a one size fits all, that they have a reliable protocol that they can run everybody through and feel like they're doing a good job with the client. Because of the nature of the adaptations to trauma, which are entirely individual, entirely based on the individual's history, it's going to be incredibly difficult to find a treatment model that fits even the majority of people that is delivered in the same way. However, a trauma structure, which is how you organize treatment, can be concrete, it can be specified, and it can help organize people so that they can benefit from the individualized treatment that they experience. Another popular treatment for PTSD is medication, of course. Um, Interestingly enough, I had a discussion with a psychiatrist recently. We were at lunch, and he was talking about one of the conversations that he'd had with one of his clients around the issues of trauma. And he was encouraging the client to use less medication. Apparently, in the 6 or 7 years prior to coming to this psychiatrist, they'd been on as much as 4 or 5 different psychoactive medications at any one time to deal with their PTSD. And the psychiatrist related that he'd had this conversation with that client. And he told me that what he said to the client was, medication is allowing you to navigate in a room with the lights out. You're still bumping into things, you're still having bruises on your shins, you're still have the benefit of not seeing how cluttered and awful the room looks, but you're also not being as effective in getting it cleaned up because the room is dark. That taking less medication and doing therapy is going to turn the light on in that room. And then you're going to see just how awful that room really is. But until you can turn the light on, how are you going to possibly get it cleaned up and make it a habitat that you can live in? I thought that was an interesting metaphor coming from a psychiatrist. Use less drugs and do more therapy as an avenue to turn the light on in their darkened world. I really liked it. And I'm sharing it with you for whatever value you might find in it. And if you feel like you'd like to reference the person that said it, it was, and I'm not quoting it exactly, so feel free to steal it and use it. But Dr. Laurel Patino in Arizona, who is a pediatric psychiatrist. So let's go through the triphasic treatment structure. Once again, this is based on Judith Herman's 1992 work Trauma and Recovery. It's published by Basic Books. One of the things that she makes a statement in there that I really, really like is that within the U.S., a number of large-scale community studies have demonstrated that even in peacetime, exposure to violence is both more commonplace and more damaging than anyone would like to believe. One of the things that's interesting about that is that she is really saying what leads to, if you will, some popular mythology in our society. Almost everybody will tell you, well, kids are so resilient, they're going to get over that. They won't even remember that. They're so young, they won't even remember that. And the reality is that we understand more and more how that is not true. We understand more and more how commonplace and damaging environments can be to folks, and that those damages can last 50 plus years in the life of an individual and impact them physically, physical health wise, psychologically, emotionally, and even in their ability to fight off disease. So, as she was writing this in 1992, the ACE studies hadn't been started yet in California, and many other studies that were underway have led to and confirmed this statement. But I think it's interesting, excuse me, I think it's interesting that we are still struggling with the idea that the environments that we're creating for children, however we believed they were going to move through it and be okay, that may not always be the case. And in fact, it's often not. Another comment, and you can read this, or maybe you have read it in her book already, but I'm going to recommend it to you. At the end of her trauma and recovery book, it's a more updated version. I think it's a 1997 publication. She writes in and afterwards that insight into recovery process may also be gained by drawing upon the wisdom of a majority of trauma survivors worldwide who never get formal treatment of any kind. If you remember the lesson that I introduced on the history of trauma and talked about how traditional healers for many, many, many generations have been dealing with trauma, this is really kind of a hearkening to that idea that worldwide people survive trauma and overcome it, often without formal treatment. The rest of the statement: to the extent that they recover, most survivors must invent their own methods, drawing on their individual strengths and the supportive relationships naturally available to them in their own communities. And that systemic studies of resilience in untreated survivors hold a great promise for the developing of more effective and widely adaptable methods of therapeutic intervention. The search for simple and reproducible models of intervention has now become an international, cross-cultural project as part of a growing effort to mount an effective international response. When we move, at the end of today's lesson, when we move into the idea of a more mature model than the triphasic model, one of the things that we focus on is the post-traumatic growth and resiliency. And part of the reason that we focus on that is because it has been an area that has proven to be so helpful to many, many people as they move through the treatment process. So let's continue with the triphasic model. So the triphasic model, the first phase or stage is the safety and stabilization. And some of the tasks of this stage are listed here for you to kind of look at. So kind of read through those at your leisure, either in the PowerPoint or here in the video. And ask yourself, are you accomplishing these things before you move into intervention? because that was the reason for structuring it. One of the things that it has been discovered is that way too often people move into intervention before the stage is set, the process is in place. And one of the rationale that I use often when I'm training people on trauma treatment is the fact that we, being a human being, we are organic and we go through an organic process. Organic processes have beginning, middles, and ends. And a lot of times we have the equivalent in therapy where people are throwing seeds on the ground and screaming, yield, when they haven't prepared the soil. And then they wonder why the seeds don't grow and why they don't get the harvest that they would like. So if you think about safety and stabilization is a preparation of the soil, making sure it's adequately watered, that it's adequately nutritious, that it is adequately beneficial, and it is the right environment for the kinds of seeds you're trying to plant in it. Then planting the seeds and nurturing them until you're ready for a harvest. So in when we're dealing with human beings in a therapeutic process, we need to keep in mind that it is an organic process and that this safety and stabilization piece is hugely important to setting the stage for them to be effective in the resolution part of therapy. If we haven't done a good job with setting the safety and putting things in place to help them be successful, then we are likely to get a less of a yield or less of a harvest in the therapeutic intervention phase of treatment. In stage 2, or the second phase of trauma treatment, which can be trauma resolution or trauma focus, what we're really looking at are valid treatments that help us do cognitive processing through a variety of exposure kinds of responses. And we're doing this to desensitize and eventually help free a person from the reactions that they've experienced. So the core elements that are true regardless of whichever trauma treatment model you're using is exposure to the trauma in some form, processing of the trauma in some form, and decreasing the adaptive responses that have been traditional to that exposure and the repetition and the triggering of that exposure to decrease avoidance, to increase tolerance, and ultimately to reduce or eliminate the distress related to the trauma itself. And one of the other things that we're kind of looking at is that there's many avenues to accomplish these elements, even within a set model of treatment. So essentially, you're going to be reviewing and discussing memories to lessen their emotional intensity and to revise the meaning or the perception of those in the life of the client. Additionally, the trauma focus has an ability to kind of deal with some of the grief and unwanted feelings associated with the incidents or the traumas in their history. And part of that mourning is to mourn the loss of what could have been and wasn't. In the stage 3 part of, or phase 3 part of treatment for Judith Herman's material, we're really looking at how do we help reestablish relationships. How do we reconnect with friends and family or community? How do we find support in the community? And often, particularly, we see more and more of this in different church communities, and not just Christian churches, but a whole array of different denominations and faiths are beginning to have support groups that deal with different elements of trauma and support and are finding that their membership are more easily able to deal with their trauma histories and maintain their recovery if they have these kinds of supports in place in the community. And that in the final part of this reconnection phase is moving through the grief and loss and the emotional letting go of those things that um, one wishes hadn't happened then did, and the mourning of things that you wish had happened that haven't. So it's a really important phase of treatment and allows for, if you will, generalization and an ability to kind of complete, if you will, um, the entire process. Uh, I find sometimes that people end up coming back to therapy when the phase 3 wasn't done. A lot of times when the relief is so palpable at the end of stage 2 or the second phase of treatment that sometimes people feel that they are done. And part of that is our fault as therapists for not orienting them to the overall process of therapy so that they understand that they will get relief, they will feel better, they will have changes of states, and that before we're completely through with therapy, it's helping them consolidate those and move forward. So the fundamental idea of the phasic model is that there are activities that affect both the inner self and the outer self, and that through the stages of through the phases of treatment that we're able to work on both the inner parts and the outer parts of an individual's life. And whereas if we don't have an overall structure, we may be overly focused on one side of that or the other. For example, how many of you have met people that are way over focused on behavior? That it's behavior this, behavior that. We have to, their primary goal is to affect behavior. Well, if your primary goal is to affect behavior, you also need to understand the inner self and what's going on there, because behavior is driven by the inner self. But a lot of programs and a lot of treatment really just focuses on the outer self. I don't know at what point we decided that we could separate the two in psychology. I mean, the history is pretty clear, but it was an unfortunate thing in some aspects. So part of having a structure allows us to work on both the inner and the outer. Now I want to introduce to you again, because I've introduced it once before, the International Association of Trauma Professionals treatment structure. And if you want the name of the treatment structure, it is the Empowerment and Resilience Treatment Structure. Let me make it very clear. This is not a model of treatment. It is a structure in which any model can be housed to be more effective. So the stages of the empowerment and resilience structure are these 4 stages. Stage 1 is relationship building. Stage 2 is psychoeducation and self-regulation skills training. Stage 3 is the trauma resolution, which includes the grief and loss portions. And stage 4 is post-traumatic growth and resilience. Back when I was talking to you about what Judith Herman wrote in her book Trauma and Recovery, I read to you, and in fact I think I have it written out, yes I do, the page from page 241 of her text about how we're having to draw insights from people that aren't formally treated, and we're looking at resiliency and post-traumatic growth as kind of the finishing portion of the organic process of treatment. So that's how this, well, this is part of how this model came in, this structure came into play. So one of the things that fascinated me years and years ago, as I was introduced to Judith Herman's work, was how much it helped organize the therapy for individuals, but it wasn't very helpful in in helping organize the work we were doing with families. And what would frequently happen is they would take a child and send the child to treatment and then put them back with the family. And a lot of times the family dynamic needed to change in order to allow the child to benefit. So over the years, this became a more effective working model for me in working with family work. And I found that it works both with families and individuals. And I think of it as a maturing, if you will, of the work started by Judith Herman. Now, am I biased this way? Yes, because I've used it a lot. Um, it is the treatment structure that I teach um, therapists that work in and around trauma through the university, but is also the treatment structure that I use in my own lab, which, training therapists to do therapy for both individual and families. So I really have an investment in this as a structure. However, um, there are other really good structures. Charles Figley has what he calls the empowerment structure, which is a five-stage um, model for dealing with family work. And you can plug pretty much any model of treatment into that structure as well. So there are many structures now where, 20 years ago there was not. So I'm offering this up and I'm discussing it as if it is the one because of my own Catholicism to this structure. It is only the one for that has helped me do better quality of work. And there are some differences with the triphasic. So let me kind of remind you why we start with relationship. This is a familiar slide. You've seen it in other presentations. But the idea is that when we experience adversive traumatic events, it activates the threat response system and reduces the positive emotional states that we have, and that the positive feelings get increasingly reduced with the more often and the more intensely that we arouse the threat response system. Therefore, we're really looking at people feeling less connected, less pleasure, less motivation through the warm activations of the ventral vagal complex. So relationship building in and of it, from a physiological point of view, is to create as many warm activations in that system as possible so that the client can have a greater change of state. Just kind of review again, these are the aspects of the ventral vagal complex that help us all feel good about the relationships we have in our life and about the things that we are effective and strong in. So we really want to start there by creating activation in the ventral vagal complex, and not just one or two, but as many as we can each session in the early stage of treatment, because this allows us to help the client experience a change of state in our presence and to generate a change of state for themselves. Part of what we're talking about in stage 2, which is the psychoeducation and the self-regulation skills, is taking the hope that we demonstrate for them in stage 1 that they can be in charge of their own states, and now educate them on why that is so, model it for them, teach them how to do that so that they can change their own states. And when we find that they can do that, they benefit from treatment, the third stage of treatment, third stage of this structure, so much more effectively. So the basic idea is that resilience and recovery are based on feeling different, a shift in state, and that by activating the VVC, we promote calm states. We are inhibiting sympathetic nervous system activation. We're increasing overall emotional regulation. We're increasing derivatives of positive connections. In other words, we're getting better attachments. We have a more attuned communication, and we feel better in people's presence. Um, Often, from this structure, we find people leaving the session rather than being burdened and heavy, feeling lighter and happier and more positive than they were when they first came in. Stage two, the psychoeducation and self-regulation skill building. Um, if the relationship piece has been adequately developed, then we're already setting the stage for this to be very effective. You're going to normalize their experience and the adaptations they've made based on neural and physiological changes that have occurred because of their experiences. We're going to talk about how their adaptations and their behaviors and their perceptions are pretty normal for what people have gone through. You're going to help also create an expectation for moving through this. For example, a statement that I use quite often, in fact, my students call it the three sums. So some people are going to experience this, they're exposed to these ideas, they really get them, and they run with them like crazy, and they really get through it quickly. Some others, it takes them a while to kind of get a handle on it, but they get it, and then it takes them a little longer and a little bit more work, but they get it and are quite successful at it. Then some others are ones that really have to work hard to master it, and their progress isn't as fast as what they would like, and they get kind of impatient with the process, but as they persist, they also get a handle on this and move through it very successfully. So the three sums is kind of set up as an idea that no matter what they do, they're right, they're going to be successful. And that kind of thought process and the kind of structuring of what we do in the stage two helps people develop that belief, that faith that they really are pretty normal and they are going to be pretty able to move through this. So, and then we move into some of the actual self-regulation skills training, and you probably have started to model some of those things in stage one. Modeling, not asking them to reproduce them, just modeling them. And then as we move into this stage, we're going to ask them to reproduce some of those things. The danger with this is people tend to want to shortcut this stage. They want to teach one or two or three self-regulation skills that they've been to some kind of mindfulness workshop and learned, and they like it and they want to teach it. Part of this is really important to derive the feedback informed treatment, because the therapists often like to do things that the clients really don't. So you have to have enough breadth in different ways to approach the self-regulation and the skill building phase, that you have at least 8 to 10 solid skills, and I would recommend probably closer to 15 or 20 that you can use with a client, and you can use them because you have used them on yourself enough that you can explain and verbalize the benefits as you walk them through it. So that's stage two. Stage three isn't very different than the stage, then the second phase of treatment in Judy Herman's work. It's narrative exposure and grief work. Remember, don't become over focused on a particular model of treatment. We know of at least 16 bona fide, research substantiated treatments, and when they're embedded in a structure, they all pretty much equal the equivalent results. And finally, the post traumatic growth and resiliency stage. Um, what are we doing in this stage? Well, the first part is we're kind of consolidating um, the change in perception that they have about themselves, consolidating their new identity. We are consolidating positive aspects of their relationship. We're increasing their ability to relate to other people. We are helping them explore new possibilities to really solidify their understanding of their own personal strengths. And often we see people go through these massive spiritual changes and a lot of maturity that they didn't have before. We also see an appreciation of life, and we help consolidate a different philosophy of life, if you will, that is going to create more positive outcomes in their overall world. And we also work on helping them be more resilient. And these are the normal resiliency factors we're kind of looking at, but this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. Once again, resiliency is highly community connected. You want to get them connected to a community, whether that's an extended family or whether it's a church community or whether it's a ethnic community. You want to get them connected to their community. You also want to help them move from the perspective of what makes sense to them rather than trying to dictate the elements of resiliency, which once again is a reason why we use feedback informed treatment. So let me kind of talk briefly. I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on the empowerment and resiliency structure that we use at the International Association of Trauma Professionals. But what I am going to talk about is really for you is life is always about choices. And you have some choices to make. And part of the choices that you have to make is, do you believe that the structure of treatment that you use could be improved? And if you do believe that, what are you doing this week, next week, this month to actually put those changes in place and to practice them and to practice them and to practice them so that they become less something that you are clinky and stumble through and more natural and graceful as you move through them. So that takes a choice. That's a conscious, intentional practice on your part. What we do know is that clients love choice. Therapists love choices too, but clients love choices. So if you're going to start this process and really hone it, you need to use the feedback informed treatment structure. The feedback informed for every phase of interaction with the client, because part of what you're doing for them is giving them a choice. You're giving them a voice in what happens to them, which is an empowering process for people that often feel oppressed and helpless, and they are exploring the darkness rather than looking for the light. So I invite you and challenge you to implement the structure. If you don't care for the one that I've just described that we use for the International Association, then go back and become really astute at the one Judith Herman produced. But please, begin to structure treatment so that it's consistent and predictable for your trauma client. think that really concludes most of what I wanted to chat with you about today, and I hope that you find it beneficial. I will email the link to this to everyone later today, and I will also post the PowerPoint for your privilege, I guess, whatever you want to do with it. And and later this week, I'm sure Chelsea will post the video on the um, IATAP site. However, I will go ahead and send you the link sometime later today. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing back from you. Take care. Bye bye.